Hello, everyone, and welcome to Elevate Energy's Town Hall. We're going to get started right now. I believe we are kicking off our recording. All of our team is working behind the scenes, and we're thrilled that you are here. Thank you for joining us at this time when our worst tendencies and our broken systems are exposed. We're also at an intersection when great and positive change can occur. I'd love to ask one of our panelists, Pastor Unquay, we're gonna come to you in just a second. I might see you on the screen. So if you want to mute your camera, you can. Otherwise, we're just glad that you're here. But what's going on? We're family. We're thrilled to have you join us. And coping and building in this moment is the first in the Elevate Energies, Elevating Our Voices series of summer virtual town hall meetings. We're sharing the perspective of Elevate staff and our valued collaborators. And in this town hall discussion, we'll provide an update on our response to the moment that we're in, from the pandemic to what the violence that's been uncovered is teaching all of us, and what can we learn about racism and inequality. We'll also examine the 5-phase reopening plan for Illinois and discuss how we can move from inequity to justice for all, which is central to rebuilding our communities stronger and better. So the theme of this first town hall is coping and rebuilding in this moment. We don't want to go back to a new normal. We invite your participation in our chat a little bit later. We've got a designated section for your questions and our responses. And we appreciate the support of a new energy publication, Energy News Network, and their Midwest Technology newsletter, Centered, for helping us to promote this event. Centered is absolutely free, and you can sign up at centered.tech. But right now, let's take a moment before we get to Delmar Gillis, Ruth Kersey, Ann McKibben of Elevate Energy, and Pastor Scott Unquay of Faith in Place to center where we are on this day before Juneteenth, in a week of momentous news from the Supreme Court regarding our friends in the LGBTQ plus community, as well as the Dreamer communities. Let's take a moment of silence to send our thoughts to those who are in distress, and to send solace and solidarity for change in the names of those who were taken by COVID or by police involved violence. So let's just take that moment to center and send those thoughts. Thank you for that. So now let's get the conversation started. We are hoping that you'll send out tweets to hashtag elevating their voices or hashtag coping and building better so others can join us. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our COO, Mr. Delmar Gillis, who will tell you a little bit more about himself and where Elevate is in this moment. Delmar?
Thank you, Sylvia, and thanks for moderating this very important discussion. I'd also like to thank the panelists as well as all of you who are participating in this town hall. As Sylvia mentioned, my name is Delmar Gillis. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Elevate. And my role here at Elevate is I support the organization's operations. I also have been coordinating our COVID-19 response with our crisis management team. And I've also supported our water distribution efforts to get water out into the community. I would like to spend just a few minutes talking about Elevate's response to the pandemic, and more recently, the protests around police accountability as it relates to the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and more recently, Rayshard Brooks. Specifically, where I would like to start is a note from our CEO that she sent out on Twitter on June 1st. And I think it accurately captures a lot of the key themes that I'd like to talk about. I'm not going to read all of this note to the community, but I think there's a couple of key points in it that I think really resonate that Anne included in this note to the community. It starts off, "Dear community, I want to acknowledge the pain that we are all feeling during this time of sadness and outrage. I feel the pain of every mother, father, sister, brother who lives in fear of losing their loved ones to violence. The death of George Floyd is yet another unnecessary tragic loss of a Black man's life. I believe that we must name the racism that created this condition and for the ongoing loss of life. We must name it in order to expunge it, to support the Black community, and to do the work of anti-racism toward justice. Anyone who works for a safe, sustainable world must speak out against these actions." Lastly, she said, "The continued devaluation of the lives of Black people is at the core of both environmental racism and the brutality by people who should not be police. It is essential that communities combating environmental racism join in the shared struggle against police brutality and the violence of the criminal justice system. The murder of George Floyd is a tragic wake-up call." She continues to provide a very eloquent quote from Martin Luther King. But what I wanted to really touch on, as I heard that myself, were two key things. First and foremost, since she posted that, unfortunately, there was yet another killing of Rashad Brooks since June 1st. So even as we are trying to work and process what's going on, it continues. And secondly, and also importantly for this discussion, you cannot separate systemic racism from environmental issues. Oftentimes, issues of environment, sustainability, and racism are interlinked. So the question I want to ask is, what are we doing about it, and what is Elevate specifically doing about it? And I think there's a couple of key things that I wanted to highlight as we begin this discussion. First and foremost, what Elevate really wanted to focus on was keeping our communities and the members of our communities safe. So before we started anything, we were reaching out to partners, community advocates, friends in the community to make sure they were safe, that they were protected, because unfortunately, similar to many things, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities, and those are the communities that needed our help the most, and that's where we started. Secondly, we wanted to look at our programs and adjust those programs to meet the needs of the community. We also knew that in order to do that, in many instances, we had to pivot and focus on different types of services than maybe we were providing before. And I'd like to just touch on a few examples. For instance, when we start looking at our communities and the contractors in those communities, many of them needed assistance sustaining their businesses through the pandemic. So we worked to help them get PPP loans, which are the payroll protection program that the federal government started. Many of them did not have the resources or the back office to apply for these forgivable loans. And so we stepped in and did what we could to assist, answer questions, and provide links to resources. We also created a resource page for those that maybe either needed more than the PPP or did not qualify. There were other organizations out there that were providing loans, grants, and information that were helpful. We also took a real hard look at our programs and said, hey, if we're not able to engage directly in the community, what can we do to bring those programs online? But what was more important than just transitioning to a remote access stance was, do the communities have the technologies, the tools, the computers to actually access online tools? And so what we did was we worked with our partners to provide those tools to our partners so that they could help. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, we felt that it was important to pivot. One of the things that was really critical in our communities was that there were people that were struggling without water, without food, and we really needed to make sure that we had programs available to provide food, water, and resources to seniors and to those that had had their water cut off throughout the pandemic.
Oh, Delmar,
So,
and that's going to be a great thing to pick up on in just a minute as you finish your
yes.
thought.
Yes, and I was going to say, Sylvia, that's actually where I wanted to end with that point, which is, once again, we cannot separate our environmental sustainability community challenges from racism and from the protests that are going on. And I think having this conversation together with both topics is critical to finding great solutions.
Thank you, Delmar. Two snaps and a lot of virtual applause to you. Our next speaker is another Elevate colleague, Ruth Kersey. She has led us in our response and understanding of what's going on in the world and Elevate's place in it. And she's going to give us an overview on the state. Ruth?
Thanks so much. So I'll give Charles a minute to pull up my slides here. Great. And just say thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm very excited to talk about this with everyone out there. I have a background in public health, so I geek out on this stuff. There will be a lot of numbers coming at you. And what I really want you to do is just sit back. There's a lot of pictures and just sort of absorb what I'm telling you here without trying to like look at all the numbers all the time, because I think it might be a little intense for you. So with that, Charles, if I could, if you would advance, great. So I have this slide up here. It's a little older slide. It's from March and it comes from the Brookings Institute. And basically what it does is it points out that the 50 hardest hit counties in the country represent about 40% of the GDP. And the reason why I want to point that out is that often people think it's about resources, right? So in areas that are getting impacted, we want to provide additional resources, but COVID has really shown us that our areas in the country that really represent a lot of our GDP and a lot of the work that gets done and our economic powers are being hit very hard by this COVID situation, and we want to provide resources to those areas. So the bright red spots on this map are the areas that are being hit hardest, and you can see that Chicago right there at Lake Michigan is being hit hard, and then it sort of trickles out across Illinois from there. If you could advance twice, Charles, to the next picture, great. So this is Illinois, and it shows you how it sort of spreads out from Chicago, but also follows sort of the density of the state for how COVID is hitting us. And although density is part of the issue here, we wanted to be focused on the fact that it's more than just the number of people living in the area for why COVID is hitting us so hard there. So we'll explore that in the next slide. You could advance. There you go. So here we are just showing in Illinois who is being hit hardest by COVID. And you can see that the Latinx or Hispanic community is being hit the hardest. This is the number of cases by race, ethnicity, and gender. So 42% of all the cases that have been identified in the state of Illinois are in the Latinx community, 22% are in the Black community, and about 26% are in the white community. But if you look at those green numbers underneath there in parentheses, that's the percentage of population that's represented by those different groups. And if we were being equitably hit, so everybody equally being hit, the numbers would match. So you can see here, it's much higher in the brown and Black communities than it is in the white communities. And I just want to give a shout out to our female friends. We're getting hit a little harder than males, and there's reasons for that as well. Go ahead, Charles. So that was Illinois as a whole. And here I am sort of honing down to Chicago, and I apologize for not having other graphics from other cities in the state of Illinois, but I did review them and they are very similar to this. It's just that it was easier to pull this one up. And you can see that in the Black community, again, the Black and brown communities are being hit harder. One thing that's very concerning in the Black community is the death rate. So they're only, they have a lower positivity rate, for example, than the Latinx community, but they have a higher death rate when they're infected from COVID. And there's reasons for that, which we'll talk about in a minute here. Go ahead, Charles. So those are the communities being hit. And this is a real, sort of a, well, real time, because I took this off the internet yesterday. On the left is March and on the right is June. And you can see the different communities being hit. The blue line is the Latinx community. The purple line is the African-American community. And the black dotted line is the average of number of people with confirmed COVID cases in Illinois. And the good news of this is that we're coming down and we're all starting to converge on that black dotted line, which is really encouraging, which is showing that some of the things that we've been putting in place that the governor has called for and the departments of health have called for are working. Next slide. And so what we really want to delve into is why this is happening. So I talked a little bit about density, but we know with COVID that underlying conditions are really a very important factor for how this strange virus is really affecting us. And what I did here is I highlighted the areas where in the Hispanic / Latinx community, African-American community, white communities are being hit hardest. And you can see that some of those underlying conditions that make COVID worse for people that have them are highest in some of those brown and black communities. And there's reason for that. So advance again, Charles. But it doesn't really tell the whole story, right? So we know that some of these underlying conditions are higher in black and brown communities. And part of the reason for that has to do with the types of jobs we do and where we live, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but also just the jobs we do in general are very impactful. 64% of all frontline workers are women, for example, which correlates very well with why we're being overly impacted by COVID. But 40% of frontline workers are people of color. And if you can't shelter in place, like many of us have been able to do, you're going out in the world and you're doing your job, you're going to bring back COVID to yourself, you're going to bring back COVID to your families, and that spreads the impact to greater degrees. And I just want to point out, many of you may have heard about the meatpacking industry and the Latinx community being hit very hard by that. And that has very much to do with that. They're frontline workers, they're out there and they're getting exposed. Next, Charles. And then so we have these underlying risk factors. We have the frontline working conditions that we're in, but another risk factor is age. And what this is showing you is you can see at the bottom of this graph, it's 0 to 4 years old, and at the top is 85 years old. So this is basically the composition of our populations by age. And you can see that even though the Latinx community, for example, is being hit very hard, they represent a lower number of elderly in our communities, whereas African Americans and white communities tend to have higher ages, higher percentage of people of the ages of concern, which is 65 above in these communities. So that also adds into why there are more cases, and then again, more death having to do with being exposed to COVID. One more slide. And then we absolutely cannot ignore the racism and racial segregation and how they contribute to things. So this is a map of Chicago showing sort of the racial, basically the racial breakdown of the neighborhoods in Chicago. And you can see how segregated they are. So some of these areas are more densely populated. They tend to be in lower income areas, for example. Racial and residential segregation leads to things like grocery stores and medical facilities being farther away and being more difficult to access. Of course, the stresses of living in some of these communities and living at low income increases the likelihood that you'll have underlying conditions. And then multi-generational households, people of lower income who are segregated in certain areas often have much more multi-generational contact. And then finally, a lot of the Black and brown communities are overrepresented in jails, prisons, and detention centers. So hopefully this gives you guys a kind of a good picture of what's happening with COVID in the state of Illinois. I know it's a lot to absorb, but we know that people of color in Illinois are bearing a disproportionate impact to COVID-19 outbreak. The reasons are multifaceted, but of course, racism and racial segregation certainly play a significant role in it. And that interventions can have a positive impact on these communities, which is what Elevate Energy is working towards. And so we're hoping that when we get these resources in, we'll be able to equitably distribute them to the communities that need them most. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Lots of information. You can get a copy of the slides a little bit later. We'll make sure that that happens. the tip of the iceberg, but we have to start with the facts, and we believe in science at Elevate Energy. We also believe in the power and importance of community voice, and we're so honored that Pastor Scott Unquay is here to give his perspective. He can tell you a little bit more about himself, but we love working with him and with Faith in Place. Pastor?
Good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm Pastor Scott Onquay, the Policy Advocacy Director for Faith in Place, as well as the Faith in Place Action Fund. I've been on the ground working in the community in the area of social justice for at least 20 years of my ministry. I'm also the pastor of a church on the southeast side of Chicago, historic African-American congregation, and I've been pastoring here for about 16 years now. At the wake of COVID-19, as March approached and the state shut down, and we realized the city was also shutting down, it became very obvious that it was going to be a great effect on our communities, especially communities of color, where my church actually resides in one of the communities that was stricken the worst by the COVID-19 virus. When we saw that it was clear that food disparities, healthcare disparities were leading to many of the morbidity diseases that were in our community that were affecting largely those people of color. In March, the city announced that at 1.72% of the deaths due to COVID-19 were African-American. And it was just a startling statistic that happened in the city of Chicago. And I wrote an op-ed at that time about that I'm not really surprised by this statistics, because I realized that for years there's been great disinvestment in the African-American community. It was very clear that in the 60649 zip code, we went 6 years without a food market within a mile radius of those that lived in this zip code. And that means that they did not have access to fresh fruits and vegetables and a dietary plan that would promote healthy eating. It was also clear that we were not getting to the doctor on a regular basis, having an assigned general practitioner to make sure that we check our health on a regular basis. And so when the disease hit, as I heard that when America gets a cold, the African-American community literally gets pneumonia, or somebody even stressed that we die. Well, we started dying, and we started having a lot of depression and mental illness was escalated in this community because people were trying to figure out what was happening. Well, some of the response was that we know that we're ministries and we operate as a ministry. Faith in Place has a connection of over 1,000 churches throughout the state of Illinois. And it's in that partnership, we have what they call a green team model. And we help our faith communities understand how they can play a role. And, you know, one of the things is food sustainability. So even at my church, we did what they call a pop-up food pantry. And we partnered with some community partners, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Illinois of Chicago Health Systems. And we provided 2,000 bags of groceries to the community that was within reach of this zip code. We delivered those bags of groceries as they signed up saying they needed food. And we put things that are really like staples in the bags. A $20 bag of groceries were delivered to so many individuals and so many families. But we knew that wasn't enough. So then we said, okay, well, we know that testing is not happening in our community, and everyone kept talking about testing. So we started partnering with other partners, and we partnered with the Howard Brown mobile testing unit and had them come out. And several churches in our communities actually did that. So parishioners as well as the neighbors were able to come get COVID testing without having to seek it out. But we knew that wasn't enough also. We felt that we still had to do more. So what do we do? But as we were dealing with COVID-19, we had an interruption in our response to COVID-19 because of the deaths that happened subsequently. First, it was Ahmaud Arbery taking a run on a Georgia street. and he was chased down by 3 men on a truck and shot down in the street. That caused anger. But then we read and heard about Breonna Taylor's in her bed in the middle of the night, no knock warrant. Police kick down her door, and her partner tries to defend himself, and they release 20 bullets, and 8 of them hit her, and she's dead. And then, if that wasn't enough, we got the chance to see a man, actually a public lynching, a man laid in the streets in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and with an officer's knee on his neck. And that caused a great outrage in our community. And we knew at that point that even though we were in the midst of a pandemic, even though we were in the midst of a deadly virus, we had to have a reaction. And so as a community, ministers and many organizations participated in protests all around the country. But here, even in the city of Chicago, we marched up Martin Luther King Drive from 26th Street to 51st Street, led by multiple faiths and multiple demographics. And it was a great day of 10,000 people marching up King Drive, historic King Drive. But again, that wasn't enough, because by the time we got that march and planned another march, yet another life was taken in Georgia. And here, Rashad Brooks' life is taken, shot in the back. And so the charges were announced about him. And so again, as we are dealing with COVID-19, we're dealing with so many other things as a community. And this is important. Elevate, thank you for inviting me just to share what we're doing as a community, because we realize that we're all in this together. Many of the partnerships that are being forged, we realize that a change is going to happen, a change is occurring, because America has been awakened between COVID and systemic racism. And we realize how systemic racism played a role with so many deaths in the community of African Americans, in the Latinx community. And we saw the charts that the previous panelists displayed and showed you the statistics, and we know that something must be done about it. And so as we engage in this conversation and take questions from you tonight, it is my prayer that this is solution-based as we move forward, and we'll come up with a remedy that works best for everyone. And at the end, we'll get the victory and God will get the glory. Thank you for your time. And I want to turn it back over to our beautiful host, Sylvia Ewing.
Well, thank you, Pastor. There will be nothing extra in your paycheck for that. But seriously, we've got a very robust conversation going on. And someone just said to Jeremy, who's our chat director, and our great team here, Adrian directing, Yami, the coordinator of this whole series, our IT, thanks to everybody for making that happen. Someone talked about the relationship between COVID-19 and 1619. I also have to say that when the pastor mentioned the zip codes, it reminds me of the documentary Cooked Survival by Zip Code, because we know that the same communities, the same zip codes are impacted unfairly and excessively by all of these challenges. And there are some policy implications to all of this. So I'm going to introduce you to my colleague, Anne, who will share the political response and policy structure surrounding COVID-19. Give them your fancy title, Anne.
Oh, my fancy title. I'm Policy Director at Elevate Energy. Thank you so much, Sylvia. So at Elevate, I work on all of our policy around clean energy, clean water, and healthy housing with the rest of our policy team. So the political and policy response to the COVID-19 crisis has come from every area of government, and it has federal, state, and local elements. As a response, we need a response from all of those levels of government as well to make change to address police reform and systemic racism. I'll talk mostly about the COVID response, though, because that's where we've seen the most change over the last several months. So the heart of the financial response is happening in Congress with the CARES Act and with other bills but those address really unemployment insurance, aid to states and municipalities that are suffering from a sudden drop in tax revenues, and other issues. So the bills we're seeing from the federal government, they have contained some provisions that address equity, such as, for example, dramatic increases in immediate funding to some of our housing programs, but they are insufficient really for us to build back better. And so continued advocacy with Congress is going to be really important. The heart of the sort of on the ground response, the what's open or closed, how much testing are we getting done, are our hospitals okay, unemployment insurance, rent relief, that really practical response that directly touches residents, that's on the state and local levels. At the state level and at the city of Chicago, that response has been really very science and fact-based, and I think was quite swift at the beginning of the crisis. Our Illinois Commerce Commission, who regulates our electric and natural gas industries, as well as several of our water utilities, but by far not all the water utilities, just a few. Our Illinois Commerce Commission was really proactive in ensuring that folks didn't get disconnected during this crisis, and that happened almost immediately at the beginning. So I think we can be thankful for that. Unfortunately, some of our neighboring states have not done the same. Our legislature has met under extreme circumstances and passed a budget and other legislation necessary to address COVID-19. They did it in 4 days. We'll see if there's going to be any special session as new needs arise. As of now, there have been murmurings, but no general outcry for one. And I think that's partly because a lot of the new needs that are arising are complicated, and folks want to make sure that they, as they think through what those reforms could be, that they make sure they get them right. I can say the trickle down from the financial relief from the federal government, it is taking more time than some of the other work that's been done so far. But just yesterday, we saw really big announcements from Governor Pritzker and the city of Chicago about how they're going to get funding they've gotten from the federal government out to residents for rent, mortgage, and small business relief, and for more aid related to food and mental health and other issues that directly affect folks. I would encourage anyone on this call to take a look at the governor's press release, but especially the websites of Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity and the Housing Development Authority, because IDA, we call it, because while they haven't got their programs up right now, they will soon. And so we want to keep an eye on that so that, we can get that money out to people who need it as quickly as possible. Now, the political response across the state has been varied. It's a big state. We've got a variety of political conditions across the state. We have a variety of virus-related conditions across the state. And there's pushback on stay-at-home and other measures from less populated areas that when they were not seeing the virus at the same time as our more densely populated, as our cities, those are more densely populated areas. I think we've seen over the last couple of weeks that the virus is reaching rural areas throughout the nation now. So I think we'll have to see how that develops. So for reopening, if we can move to the map slide, please. We'll come back to this one in a second. Oh, coronavirus.illinois.org. Yes, folks need to go there to see what's going on and how those resources are coming out. And we'll get back to that in a second. So this map comes in because reopening conditions may differ across the state. So the state's been divided into 5 regions, and each may be at a different level of reopening at a particular time. I believe everybody's at phase 3 right now, but that would depend on conditions. And so then we can go back to the slide with the 5 levels of reopening. We might have to, just depending on how things develop, we might have to kind of go up and down the scale a little bit. Hope not. Hope it will just be on a good slide towards stage 5, but we'll have to see. But the state has developed some industry-specific guidance for each level. So thanks for the slides. So I think we're seeing a careful reopening. There's an enormous need for ongoing federal financial support and for equitable implementation of federal policy to allow us to come out of this crisis as a more equitable society than we went in. It is, in a sense, it's tragic, but it's also a huge, tremendous opportunity to address historic disinvestment caused by systemic racism in our communities. but it's also a crisis. And I think as we saw in 2008 with the financial crisis, people, when they're in a crisis, they can revert to known patterns and they can revert to what's comfortable. And what's comfortable may be completely unacceptable and may not leave us in a more equitable situation. So I think it's on all of us to do everything we can to assure that communities' voice is heard and that we address this crisis in a way that also does some long-term, hopefully some long-term good. Thank you.
Anne, thank you so much for that. We appreciate your perspective, your expertise, and I'm thrilled to have you as a coworker. She works really hard to make sure that legislation has equity at its core. So moving on to your turn, we have received a few questions in our chat area. And I'm going to address this to Pastor Anque, partially because he's so popular, he's going to be jumping off for another town hall in just a little bit. But people are asking about the parallels between the impact of COVID, the impact of racism, and the moment we find ourselves in certain communities. Can you give us your perspective on why we are still at this point and what it will take for us to truly have a more equitable society? Pastor Anque?
Okay. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you and we'll see you in just a second.
Okay, that's fine. So it's clear to me that the systemic racism that has happened in communities of color for many, many, many years, the disinvestment in those communities, the lack of opportunities in those communities has caused those communities to be at greater risk. As a person that works in the arena of environmental justice, we clearly know that communities of color are greatly affected by the ills of climate change because of where they're located. And again, the disinvestment in those communities, the purposeful planting of polluting factories and companies in those communities of color. Just to throw out one statistic, 85% of polluting industries are established in communities of color throughout these United States. And so at that point, because of racism, because these things have been allowed, and because they don't see those communities as valuable, what has happened is that we have the greatest levels of asthma, breathing and respiratory diseases. We have the greatest levels of cancers, and we have the greatest levels of most health disparities. And so when COVID hit, it just unveiled the great disparities. And I think you mentioned earlier about the documentary about Cooked. And again, when you disinvest in communities and don't allow those communities to have healthy living, and then there's multiple generational families. We live grandma and mom and children. And so those families are connected. And so a younger person can bring COVID-19 home to an older person. And then we found ourselves with nursing homes.
Well, and you know what, Pastor, I want to ask you before I get some perspective from some of our other panelists, so stand by.
Mm-hmm.
We have Black women leading so many areas of our government right now and doing their best, and yet we still have these issues. Ann McKibben, talk with us a little bit about the policy and what it takes to really enact change, even when the gatekeepers change, but the structures remain. You might be muted, but let's try to hear from you.
Thank you. Yeah, so certainly, I mean, we're fortunate, and then we do have, people of color in so many positions of power in Illinois. And they have a tremendous opportunity to make change. A lot of that change has to run through systems that have been set up with a lot of entrenched interests. And so they've got a hard row to hoe, as we used to say. And so we are fortunate we've got that leadership. I think, you know, to help the movement that we're seeing right now and all the people in the streets is just really important, because it impresses upon everyone who may not have, you know, criminal justice reform as their primary interest, but it impresses everyone in every position of power, or should, that this is what the people want. And so folks who are kind of on the fence, or maybe just weren't paying attention, it really draws their attention. So I think right now there's a lot of hope. I'm given a lot of hope by it. We'll see how it goes.
And Ruth Kersey, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. I heard Clarence Jones, Dr. Clarence Jones, who was a contemporary of Martin Luther King, speak about this day, this moment. And he said that it was different even than in Dr. King's time. And he said it was because of greater involvement by white folks. What do you think has motivated so many people, not to say that you're speaking for all folks, but what's different in this moment as someone who's been involved in progressive movements for a long time? What's different to you?
I think it's really interesting because it's such a confluence of different things. It's hard to tease out exactly what is the reason why the huge outpouring now, but I think it is a combination of things. One, the knowledge is there. We all see it all the time. It's hard to hide behind your words and smoke and mirrors any longer. It's right out there. People had time to get out. I mean, when Mr. Floyd was, passed away, it was at a time when all the kids were out of school. A lot of people are home, and we were able to really express our outrage at a time when we had the time, energy, and will to do it. So I think that's important. And I think COVID, believe it or not, has also highlighted the disparities in the community in a way that maybe it hasn't been highlighted before, since it's been such a slow roll. Really, we've had enough time to digest it. It's not just one thing that happened, like a day of 105 degrees or whatever, right? It rolled and rolled and rolled. And I think that all of those things combined has really made people think, I really have to say that this is just not acceptable any longer. So that would be my perspective on it. But
well, thank you. And Delmar, we're getting requests to answer also a couple of things. How does this impact community development and losing the gains that people have made in certain communities? And also a little bit of questioning about the tension between folks. I will say that some of the tension between Latinx and African-American folks are fighting over too small of a piece of a pie. And I've really been impressed by the solidarity that leaders in both communities have demonstrated with some of the protests on the Southeast side, et cetera, saying that we are going to stand together. But talk about the economic development and community development aspects of that, please.
And thanks, Sylvia. That is an extremely important point during these times. From an economic development perspective, I think some of the things that we're really focused on are making sure that the businesses and the investments that have been made up until now are sustained and continue moving forward. And things like making sure that communities and businesses and communities have access to capital. Things like Ann McKibben was talking about, are we out in front of our legislators making sure that capital, that training, that workforce development efforts are in place so that when this pandemic lifts, people will be able to take advantage of the opportunities. I also think, to your point, I have been extremely encouraged by diverse communities coming together to work toward a common cause. I see instances where something being done wrong in Little Village, you have people in Inglewood that are upset and enraged. And when there are protests in Woodlawn, there are people from Pilsen that have gathered to support those protests. So I'm really optimistic that we can work together collaboratively to address the economic development issues, but also address some of the social and racial issues that have been raised and elevated through the killings of George Floyd and others.
Pastor Anque, how do we rebuild better? We know that we don't want to go back to the way that things were. What do we need to do at this time to plant the seeds for the future that we want?
Well, obviously, we have to reinvest in these communities and all communities with equity. We have to see who needs the most help and make sure that the most help gets to those communities. We have to look at systems that are in place and dismantle systems that interrupts the process of equity. We have to look at legislation such as the Clean Energy Jobs Act to make sure that gets passed so that we can create job opportunities of employment and entrepreneurships in communities that have been disinvested in. There's a lot we can do, but we definitely have to get started in doing it.
Thank you. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the Clean Energy Jobs Act. We want to see that on the docket when the governor goes back. There's so many important parts of that in the 4 pillars that speak to the kind of future that we want, and it has equity at its core. And it's not true that people of color, Black folks, are not interested in these issues. They hit us first, they hit us hard. So I'm going to ask each of you, whether you have your camera on or not, we've heard from Pastor Anque, how do we rebuild better? Delmar, Ruth, I want to hear from each of you, how do we rebuild better? We're going to get your closing statements after that, and then I'll wrap up. So, Anne, how do we rebuild better?
Well, I think we need to make sure that we are investing in communities where there's been historic disinvestment. We need to focus the resources that are coming towards trying to deal with this pandemic, and we need to focus them in places where folks have not had access to the resources they needed to be resilient. And I think that would be a really great start. We also need to pay a lot of attention to how all this money is being spent.
I heard that. Ruth, how can we rebuild better?
Well, I would say that one thing that COVID has done is really highlighted how we are so interconnected, where we really depend on these people working on the front lines for us. And as a public health professional, I think that a lot more attention should be brought to making sure that that workforce gets the attention and resources that they need. And that would actually have impacted many of the factors that have contributed to the impacts on the Black and Brown communities in particular. So that would be my takeaway.
And Delmar, how do we rebuild better?
I think it comes down to really one word, which is to listen. I think for far too long, we haven't listened to the communities. And I can count numerous times where we have solved problems, and then we come to the community after the solution is in place and said, how can we customize this to meet your need? And I think we've proven that that approach doesn't work. I think what we need to do is listen and engage the communities up front, let the communities take the point in coming up with solutions, and then not being afraid to change a lot of the systemic processes that have been in place for decades, in designing those processes around what the community needs are so that the community comes first, and we're taking a community first approach to solving our problems.
Thank you. Pastor Anque, I know that you have your next engagement. If you can put your camera back on one more time and give us your final thoughts before you have to go. Or I might have caught him just when he had to go.
I'm actually still here for a second, but I don't have to put the camera on. We'll start my video. Okay. Well, let me say this. Let me give my farewells. Thank you to the panelists. A great choice of individuals to share with us this afternoon, and great thank you to our hosts. But again, I would just say in my farewell, it's time to do the hard work, time to look at what has gone wrong and not be afraid to challenge the systems that have continued to perpetually keep those wrongs in place. And so as we move forward after COVID-19, after the protests, I'm sure that we'll see a change, and I'm sure we'll be pleased change reveals. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this evening's discussion.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you. Stay safe, stay centered. We have about 10 minutes left, so this is a good thing as we say farewell to Pastor Unquay, but continue the conversation. We would be remiss if we didn't use this opportunity to also talk about the legislation that's on the table. I'm going to ask Ann McKibben to come back and tell us a little bit about the difference that would be made if the Clean Energy Jobs Act was passed. Give us a thumbnail of what that is. I'm going to come to Ruth a little bit later. She tells us at Elevate how to stay safe. I'm going to ask you to do that in your closing remarks, and Delmar will get the last word before I wrap up. So Ann, talk about Sija and give us your final thoughts.
All right. The Clean Energy Jobs Act, it does a variety. It's a pretty comprehensive bill, so it does a lot of things. But some of the big ones, it would, it has a tremendous workforce development provisions in it, which would create a statewide system for helping folks get trained and get placed in the clean energy industries. And that's really needed in Illinois. There's also provisions there that would create programs for small businesses that may already be working in the clean energy space but are having trouble growing. And those programs would be set up to help them overcome the barriers between them and growth so that they can build wealth in their communities and they can hire more people in their communities as well. Other provisions would dramatically increase the resources going towards natural gas efficiency, which is important because your average household pays more for their gas bill now than they do for their electric bill. We waste a lot of heat, so there's a lot that can be done there. There are provisions to save folks money on their electric bill by reforming what we call the capacity market, which is way too wonky to even talk about, but it's a tremendous potential source of savings for every electric customer in the state. There's also provisions to assist the folks who work in the electric generation industry, who, as the generation mix moves to clean energy, folks who are working in coal plants are going to need some assistance to transition.
And Ruth, excuse me, Ann, we just got a chat from a question from one of our guests who wants to know, is there an easy way to reach out to representatives to ask them about Sija?
Absolutely. Most of your representatives, if you just Google them, or if you don't know who they are, you can Google something like Illinois legislator lookup, and they'll come up several systems where you can put in your address and it'll tell you who your legislator is. And usually there's a website link there too, or you can Google their name. And you'll get their website, and on their website there's always a page for contact me. So they will have usually either email or a phone number. Give them a call. It's really effective. You'll get somebody in their office whose entire job it is to take messages from their constituents. Representatives love to hear from their constituents. You can drop them a postcard. You could drop them an email. If they have, sometimes they have constituent coffees or town halls in their district where they get together with folks who just want to talk about whatever issue. Show up at one of those and ask them and see what their answer is. And that's an opportunity to talk about a lot of different stuff too. So those can be really nice.
Thank you, Ann. We really appreciate your perspective and an overview on a complex but very important bill. And while you were speaking, our chat director, Jeremy, put the ICJC Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition link in the website. So thank you for that question. Thank you for that answer. Ruth, talk with us about science, safety. How can we live healthy lives? Wait, you don't have to do all that. But how can we stay safe to keep up the good fight?
Well, I mean, there's some really good news, and you can see it on that one graph that I showed. If you remember the lines, 4 lines and the black dotted line, you can see where the state of Illinois required people to start wearing masks. That's when we really started coming down in numbers. And so I really recommend that everybody get themselves a cloth face covering, some sort of face covering. A couple of layers of cloth really helps a lot when you're going out and about. That means you're not contaminating folks. Of course, wash your hands often, use hand sanitizers if you need to, but washing your hands is really just fine. You don't have to use hand sanitizers, just soap and water, wash your hands, and stay 6 feet away from folks if you can. And if you do those 3 things, you're really protecting yourself a lot. And of course, if you have underlying conditions, you want to try to stay at home as much as possible and have as little interaction with folks as you can. But I'd say if you stick to those 3, the distance, the masks, and the washing your hands, we're all going to be in a lot better shape. And I'm really happy that Illinois has promoted those. So that's what I would say are the 3 most important.
Thank you, Ruth. And I'm turning on my camera here to show you I've got a cloth mask and a paper mask, so I'm double masked. Do what you have to do to stay safe. And remember, it's not just about you, it's about your grandma, your aunt. My daughter reminds me that, and my son, that I am of an age that is vulnerable. How dare they? But it is true. And we all have to do our best to take care of ourselves and each other. Delmar, I'll ask you as our COO and one of our strongest spokespeople in the community, in the media. Thank you so much for sharing Ann Evans's words. What are your closing thoughts for our webinar before I wrap up?
Yes, and thank you, Sylvia, for the kind words. What I'm really interested in kind of ending and wrapping on is a word of encouragement. I know these are extremely challenging times, and there's a lot of things out there that could have us discouraged. But I also think we are at a very critical point where we should be taking a full advantage of this moment. Never before have we seen the levels of collaboration, community engagement, and people coming together for common cause. So I would really like to end, Sylvia, by asking folks to really start to take advantage of the opportunity that's before us, to think about ways in which each of us can make a difference, to engage in the conversations that are taking place to make that difference, and then to seek action to make change a reality.
Thank you. Well, I didn't see your face there, but I appreciate your words. It has been a very strong conversation. We started with a moment of silence and solidarity for the people who are both distressed and who have lost their lives due to the pandemic and to the ongoing police violence in this country. We also had a moment to acknowledge the historic changes that have taken place at the Supreme Court for the LGBTQ plus community and for dreamers. The work isn't done for either group, but we're acknowledging that progress is being made. Our next town hall meeting is going to be July 9th. We hope that you'll be here, that you'll tell your friends about it. We'll be focused on resources for small businesses, including contractors, landlords, and nonprofits. And we look forward to having you join that. And I want to wrap up on my part by saying, be that change that you want to see. It's more than a cliche, it's a fact. This is a different time. This moment is one that is an intersection of so many forces. And there are people of goodwill. There are people who are fed up. There are people who see the hidden hand of how things have always been and want to make change. When we work collaboratively, when we work together, when we lift each other up, anything is possible. Don't forget that this is an election year, and this is an educational message to say that don't be distracted from your ability to make change at the ballot box. Don't forget that this is a census year. It is an opportunity to make change in that way as well. You can find us at elevateenergy.org. You can find Pastor Onkwe at faithinplace.org. You can continue the conversation on social media as you see fit. But I hope that you find an opportunity for deep listening and honest healing. Honest healing means that you see all of the things that are wrong and you're honest about them, and you work to make change to create the future that you want. And we heal and grow, lead and share, thrive and cope together. See you next time. Thank you.